everyone, and welcome to the round five edition of Bombercast for 2023. I'm your regular guest host, The Grizz. And with me today is a man who's really an honorary member of the Essendon board. A lot of regular posters will know him as our favourite non-Essendon poster around. It is schmuttt, Melbourne fan extraordinaire. How are you, schmuttt? And thank you for joining us.
A pleasure being here, mate. I'm very well, thank you.
We thought considering the last 20 years of Essendon, we thought bringing on someone from a well-functioning club might be good, just for a bit of a change in pace. Thanks for coming on. How's this season tracking for you guys, do you reckon, as a Melbourne fan? Are you happy with the start of the season? Are you happy with how everything's going?
Yeah, I definitely can't say I'm not happy. I looked at the first three games pre-season and probably thought, look, if we could win two, that would be fantastic, and we've done that. The Brisbane loss was very poor, but I mean, we kind of made the margin look a bit flattering at the end when the power went out for that ridiculous amount of time, and then they let us play, and we nearly came back and won, but that was realistically never happening. I'm pretty happy, mate. I think a fair bit's changed in the way we're playing, but it's round four. So
Yeah.
who knows?
It's been an interesting start to the year, hasn't it? I think the AFL's done a really good job of scheduling like for like teams. Obviously, the few exceptions you played West Coast this week, but all in all, a lot of really competitive games. A lot of teams are at that 2 or 3 win mark, and now we're going to start getting into the real cruncher games to the mid part. Obviously, you had a really good win against the Eagles on the weekend. Some extra travel in for you guys, which might help the Bombers this week, but if that's the only thing going for us, we're in trouble. How do you feel Melbourne are going this year, and how track it, compare it to maybe last year where you guys started like a house on fire, or the year before where you also started like a house on fire but ended up taking the chockies as well. How do you see Melbourne tracking at the moment as far as a unit?
Yeah, so it's funny, right? Because they were probably unironically the worst team to go 10-0, I reckon, ever to start a season last year. I mean, if you looked at the end of the season, I think we only played one team that played finals in that first 10. And like statistically, we're well down across a lot of areas. We literally just got lucky with an easy fixture. So I think the 10-0 last year was very flattering. Whereas the year before, when they went 9-1 and then subsequently ended up going 11-3, they were beating all the good teams. We just decided we were going to lose to teams like Collingwood. But yeah, no, statistically, we're way up compared to last year. Second best tackling team. Last year we were the third worst if you go by differentials, because everyone should go by differentials, not totals. But I think the other thing is the forward line looks a lot better, and that's always the question mark with Melbourne, right? Like in 2021, we won it with a pretty makeshift forward line. I think you probably had one A grader there in Fritsch, and then Cozzy was coming on, and then the Talls are very makeshift. It probably showed you don't need an amazing forward line as long as they all play their role. But this year, weirdly, we're the most accurate team. So if I pulls the stats up in front of me. Last year, Melbourne was 300 goals, 284 behinds. This year, they're 70 goals, 37 behinds. So that's pretty stark. I mean, the game against Sydney with margin was a bit flattering to us because they were a bit inaccurate, but we were very accurate. I mean, it's nice because I don't know if you watched much of Melbourne last year, but the amount of games we pissed away with 20-point leads because we were extremely wasteful was very frustrating.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I think we're tracking well. But again, it's round four. I want to get a good look at us over the next month, and then we can probably form a better opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've watched a few Melbourne games this year. I tend to watch the better teams more than the Hawthorn North Melbourne clashes, just because I want to save my brain cells. But it's funny with Melbourne. I feel like they're back. You guys are back more to where you were in 2021 in terms of your game being in order. So like your top five in intercepts, which is always your game back in 2021, there was Lever and May and Petty, although
Yeah.
Petty's playing more forward now. So
Yeah, and Lever's leading that stat this year, by the
yeah,
way. So
yeah.
like
So I
he's
think
in really good form.
yeah, I think Melbourne's top four for intercepts, but then like I said, your league one in tackles, your contested possession numbers, raw just numbers, your differentials, your clearances, they're all up.
I might just interrupt you for 1 second there. So, funny thing is, we've actually got the second worst clearance differential at the moment, but that is because that abominable game against Brisbane, where it was a negative 22 against us, has kind of screwed the maths there. Whether that's an anomaly or that's more closer to the norm against the good teams. I guess we'll see with Melbourne. They were much better against Sydney the following week. But yeah, the contested possession numbers, you're 100% right. Like they're pretty good as always, although we did lose contested possessions and clearances to the Dogs in round one, but it didn't matter because they're incredibly wasteful with the ball.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's all right. I suppose you look at the raw stats, your top five in center clearances and your top, I think in no, so
Yeah.
your bottom in stoppage clearances, which is clearances around the ground. But I think you're four or five in center clearances, and I suppose that's Melbourne's game, isn't it? You're happy to concede clearance, but you set up so
Oh,
well behind the
absolutely.
ball, which is why you have such high intercept numbers and such high marking numbers. Is that you give the opposition the stoppage, knowing that you're set up behind the ball, and it's more your centre clearance work where you take full toll. Where when Melbourne's win, I think 54 total centre clearances, 56 is number one in Gold Coast. So if Melbourne are winning more centre clearances than their opposition, you're generally taking full toll on that, and your scores through it per inside 50 and your marks per inside 50 are really high, and that's always sort of been Melbourne's deal, hasn't it, is controlling the air. And I think we'll get into the preview later. I think that's one place you might seek to take control of Essendon this weekend on for many reasons. You may well take control of Essendon this weekend. But I want to just chat briefly about your forward line, for example. So you've gone back to your sort of your genuine three genuine tools. Bailey Fritz, I think Bailey Fritz is playing. He's not.
Yeah, yeah. He only
Yeah,
missed the one game in round one.
yeah, so you go Brown, McDonald, you're resting Ruck, or you're resting Ruck prior to Gorn going down. I don't know what the deal is at the moment, but it was genuinely, you're Fritch at 193, you're two genuine tools, and you're resting Ruck as a genuine tall forward line. You seem to have gone back to that again. Even with sort of gone out, you play pretty tall, which belies the sort of forward pressure that you guys are able to generate. How have you seen that mix going forward? Because I tend to wonder if Gorn going out has, obviously it didn't at the weekend against West Coast, but I think that's more a result of who West Coast are more than who Melbourne is. Do you see that potential is an issue now that structures had to change again with Gorn out?
Well, in a funny way, like it's going to sound ridiculous, but in a funny way, Gorn out helps. Like obviously he's a champion player, like he's extremely important. Like when he's up and going, there's no other player like him in the league, right?
Yep.
But it lets Grundy play solo ruck. It lets us go a little bit shorter up forward, which I like. That's why I'm dreading the fact that we're going to bring in Ben Brown this week for a small. I would lose my mind. But because the thing is, like you said, Bailey Fritch, and he's a great because he effectively plays as the full forward. I mean, he often is manned up by probably the opponent's full back. He's targeted a lot going inside 50. I mean, he's our most reliable goal kicker. He's kicked 50 plus goals last 2 years. He's kicked 3 since he came back in round two. That's literally his job. Like that, I won't get started on how ridiculous that selfishness stuff was last year from the media, but like his job is to kick goals and that's what he's there for. But he doesn't give a lot of defensive pressure either. So, like you said, we don't want to go too tall because well, I mean, Grundy's not a great mark as is. Tom McDonald and Ben Brown, like you could argue that both are probably a bit cooked. But the one thing that has really changed in our forward line is I don't have I can't find the numbers. I'd have to go through all 18 clubs manually on the app to work this out. But we have had I would wager we would probably almost be the best tackling team inside forward 50 to start the year. And that comes down a lot to the smalls. It's Cozzy's obviously only played two, but Chandler Spargo, Neil Bullen, those guys playing well has completely changed the forward line. Like, I still believe your best players have to play well to win games, and the role players will come along for the ride. But those guys taking a step up makes a huge difference to Melbourne. Like, I think we had 20 plus tackles inside forward 50. I think 3 out of the 4 games. So I would hazard a guess we're at least top 4 in that stat. So whether that continues, we'll have to see because that's a taxing style to play. But yeah, I'm just praying we don't go too tall this week, especially because it's probably going to rain, which I'm sure you're going to touch on later.
Do you guys feel like you're the best team in the competition? So, like, if this was a tennis tournament, you'd probably have Melbourne as the 1 seed, or at least a 2 seed behind maybe Carlton. I trust Melbourne more than I trust Collingwood. Fully fit, I think.
I don't think I can say we're the best team, and we've got a shocking record against Collingwood. But like, I don't think anyone can say they're the best team at the moment. I mean, if we're going to go off results, St Kilda's probably the only one because they haven't lost yet. Like, that's stupid. They haven't played anyone good, but they haven't lost. Everyone else has had a blemish.
Yeah.
But no, I would be confident going into a final series. I mean, I think it's going to be a very even year anyway, but I would be confident. But that doesn't mean I think we're the best. Like, there's some teams I'd much rather we play more than others.
Yeah. It's funny because I know a lot of Essendon fans that I know, maybe not necessarily on BigFooty, but at least, in my life, sort of look at Melbourne with envy, noting that, 10 years ago, if you'd told Melbourne fans this is the situation they'd be in, they'd probably laugh at you. But us here at Essendon, it's pretty tough sledding at the moment. What's it like to go through, what was it before 2021? It was 50 years since your last flag, probably more, was it? Yeah, for 60s,
Well,
early 60s.
it's sorry,
What's it?
you
So,
finish.
yeah, what's it like? Just for the Essendon fans out there
Well, I
listening
mean,
for
I'm
home.
sure. I mean, I'm 33 years old, so I've seen F all success before this year, right? Whereas I'm sure Essendon supporters, even just a few years older than me, would have seen like at least two premierships, maybe three. But it's funny because I remember I was thinking about this the other day. I remember like 2017 when we missed finals by the record at the time, which I believe was broken by Carlton last year. Thanks, Carlton. It was the record lowest percentage. And obviously, that was heartbreaking to miss finals. But I remember looking at the team, right? And that was when like Oliver had a really good year that year, his second year, but he was still a kid. Petrarca was still a kid. Like all these guys are so young. And I was thinking to myself, maybe we're just not going to be good until these guys who I know can probably be A graders are going to hit their peak. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
look, it's frustrating. It takes a long time to build because like Melbourne back then had like Nathan Jones still playing well. Like Jack Viney was probably better then than he is now. Like Bernie Vince was still a good player. Jordan Lewis came in. Love Jordan Lewis. I know Essendon fans probably don't, but loved his time at Melbourne. Yeah, and it's sort of like, well, maybe we're actually not going to be that good until like the really good players hit their peak, and it's why something like I mean, I'm just a pleb fan. I've got no idea how footy works generally, but I remember saying to a very good friend of mine who's a Madison supporter, I was like, I know this is probably sacrilege, but I'm like, look, you probably wouldn't be upset if you finished bottom six this year or even bottom four because you if you like Melbourne literally became good because we just got so many cracks at the top of the draft, we had to get it right eventually. And you can throw Carlton in that basket too. If a team is crap for long enough, they're eventually going to hit something, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean that's when like you need a draft like those guys high up, and I think it's why St Kilda stuffed up for a while because they didn't really go hard at the top of the draft. And I know people say, "Oh, like Geelong," I'm like, yeah, but Geelong and Sydney the only two teams I reckon in the last 15 years who won a premiership without going through the traditional rebuild. I think every other club had a core of good draft picks as their best players. Every other club.
Yeah, I would throw the Sydney and Geelong examples out though, because when you throw Lance Franklin into that team in 2014, you have the academy selection Sydney did, with Heaney and Mills and those sorts of guys. I think with Geelong, they just kept on picking up Geelong guys. They bring Jeremy Cameron back. They were able to access top end talent without necessarily going to the draft. A
Oh,
lot
for
of it,
sure.
yeah, and a lot of Essendon fans who I think pay attention are willing to accept, at least based off last year, this year isn't going to be a great year for wins and loss columns. We didn't do a full preview for this year just because of personal stuff happening, but I had us down for about 8 wins, which generally gets you bottom six. And I think that was 8 wins, including the extra game. So it's you're 8 and 15, and we might just transition this to the Bombers now. I tend to think that our start to the year is really inflated. So we've played Hawthorn, who are going to be the curb stomp team of the competition this year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How good's that? How
oh,
good's
it's
that?
yeah. I think apparently there are clubs who are griping that it's going to be unfair for teams that play Hawthorn twice to get basically
Well,
two.
Melbourne have their man north twice. I do not know
Yeah,
how. We got the Geelong treatment in the fixture, but yeah, that's
yeah.
yeah.
We don't really take much out of that Hawthorn game. The Gold Coast game and the GWS games were the other two we won. And I think on the weekend, the pressure rating now, for people listening, people argue about the value of the pressure rating, how it's actually, it's a guide. You take it as, okay, this is what the general guide says. Now let's crunch into the numbers. The pressure rating was, I think, all-time low for 18 months or something. So like GWS didn't register and Essendon was still considered poor. So anything that you take out of those two games, I think, is minimal because, you look at the games and you're thinking, well, yeah, of course we took shit ton of marks. And of course we had a shit ton of disposals because GWS and Gold Coast put no pressure on the ball on significant periods of both those games. And the only one game we played against a team that's half decent was St Kilda, who are, a mash unit at the moment. And they put us to the sword in the first 16 minutes. So I'm really interested to see how we go against Melbourne this week. Have you been paying much attention to Essendon? I know you post previously. You've posted a bit on our board, and you're welcome to opposition posted there. But what are your thoughts or your vibes that you're picking up about Essendon to start the year, if any?
Um, this is going to sound really disrespectful, but I don't mean it in this way. Like I've got a few really good friends who are Essendon supporters, and they nominated this, not me. They said Essendon are a meme team, and I was like, you know what? When you think about it, like it is kind of right because like they're still one of the most hot and cold outfits like out there. Like they've been pretty consistent start this year, to be fair. Like they played a bad quarter against St Kilda, but they've been pretty good across the four. But I still watch an Essendon game, and I'm like, I never know what I'm going to get with this team. It's like you've got 22 Sam Frosts out there. I'm like, I just don't know what's going to happen when they get the ball. But and like I said, that's not disrespectful because Essendon sometimes play really well and
No.
win, and then they'll just play like absolute crap, and it's
No.
just like, what is your explanation for this? Like,
We have none.
oh,
No, we have not. Like dead set, you are speaking to the heart of every sort of hardcore Essendon supporter ever. And we'll get to the history of Essendon Melbourne clashes, which might be the most weird ass rivalry in the like in terms of the previous 10 years in the AFL.
I've never watched so many terrible games
Oh,
played by
it's
two teams in a
unbelievable.
row.
We'll get to that in a minute. But Essendon has this horrific ability to play up to their opponents and then the same week play down to their opponents. We did everything we could to lose that game against GWS. 11-22 loses the game against anyone else in the competition except for a team whose pressure rating didn't figure on the scoreboard. And Adam Kingsley just about ate three of his players at three-quarter time and didn't get a response. Like it was dead set. But yeah, it's a bizarre. We're a bizarre team, but I think what you said before of we need to hit the top end of the draft, I think that's about right. We've got a couple of high-end free agents at the end of this year that we're probably worried about losing in Parrish and Redmond. You'd never want to lose those guys, but there's an element of I don't think we're going to be very good this year, and so stocking up on those picks, getting games into young guys is how we're going to go it. But I did want to chat briefly about the history of Essendon Melbourne clashes, and I'll run through some notable ones, and you can add some if you want. So we've got Essendon's last finals win back when cavemen were rolling stones in order to get to work.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, was in 2004 against Melbourne. I remember watching the game. Essendon again trying to kick themselves out of it. There was I think this was 2011 when the Bombers started 8-1 or something, and Melbourne
2012.
2012,
Yep,
that's 2012. Essendon started 8-1. That was the famous sort of supplement year, which we don't need to get into. Essendon started 8-1, and then Melbourne were basically stone cold motherless at that point. And in one of the weirdest.
They were 10-1 outsiders. And I can tell you what, there was probably the proof you weren't on drugs because if you were losing to that Melbourne team, like it's impossible if you're on drugs.
Yeah, look, it was. I remember watching the game. It was like a horrific, wet, sloppy game. And Essendon
I was there. I remember it.
Oh, it was a terrible game.
I went with a bunch of Essendon supporters, so real quick to hijack. And two of them, they follow footy like more casually, but they like to come to the games because they know I'll get animated like watching Melbourne. Usually negative reactions because I get frustrated at the team, but they come along. Three-quarter time, they're like, oh, we'll go get a beer. And then they watched it from standing room, and then they didn't come out for beers afterwards because they thought I was going to be insufferable because Essendon tripped over their own feet and Melbourne won the game.
Mate, that's not all we tripped over. We tripped over absolutely. That was a horrendous game. But so that was 2012, the unlosable game by Essendon, lost to Stone Cold Motherless Melbourne. 2016, round two, the replacement year, a fond year in the memory of Essendon supporters.
The dread I felt that whole game was awful.
Essendon tipped to not win a game that year. Round two, beat Melbourne. Darcy Parish kicks a goal to seal it. Essendon fans are delusional. I remember one fan saying, finals! I was like, okay, guys, let's calm down. This is Melbourne. The following year, Danaher kicks 1-8, I think, in the first half against Melbourne in classic Joe Danaher land. That was about as good as it got.
I will give Melbourne this, and you'll remember this as well. I will give them an out. 2017, 2018, because we would play you guys and Collingwood would play Richmond because they'd have the two Anzac fixtures and they'd fixture the teams against each other to make it fair.
Oh, that's right.
And we were both 2017, 2018. I don't know if you remember. So it was both off 4-day breaks. And
yeah.
times the game was the exact same thing. The exact same thing happened in both games. It was hilarious. First half, absolute dog shit. Some of the worst football you'll see. Like, I remember watching the ball go from turnover to turnover between the arcs. Literally, it happened for about 2.5 minutes, and I was just laughing, like, this is unreal. And then Melbourne took over in the second half and ran away with the game. And the exact same thing happened 2 years ago. I think they even kicked to the same ends in the same quarters. It was uncanny. Yeah. And then there's one you haven't brought up. I mean, I can remember them all. 2013, Essendon obliterated Melbourne. That's when I was in uni.
Oh,
I remember I was working at Coles.
Yeah.
And I saw the score when I finished my shift and just laughed and went home. Like, didn't even bother turning it on because it was already like 8 goals to 1 at quarter time or something obscene. Essendon absolutely humiliated Melbourne. That was the loss where, like, Mark Neal was going to get sacked anyway, but that was a loss that just made it untenable because we were terrible against Port the first week and then Essendon just embarrassed us the next week.
I remember that. Stuart Cranberry got subbed off after kicking 8 goals in the first 3 quarters. I do remember that game. I remember we lost the next week, I think, which is classic Essendon.
There was famous images of all the Melbourne fans waiting at the race as the players walked off. And normally when you see all the fans waiting at the race, it's a good thing. Was not a good thing that night.
Yeah.
Then 2014, we beat you by a point, and that was another game of Danaher and the whole Essendon team. I don't know how I can remember this. I remember Bell Chambers had a shot from the top of the square and put it straight into the goalpost at the start of the last quarter. I turned to my mate and I'm like, no, Melbourne's actually going to win. Like, if you guys are literally going to miss that, like, I don't see how we can't win. Like, it's just not meant to be for Essendon tonight.
I remember this. Lyndon Dunn turned into Stephen Silvani at fullback. It was unbelievable to watch. I remember that game. That was the year Bomber Thompson was coaching us. And me throwing... I was dating a Melbourne supporter at the time. That was hard. But
that was. I just remember being elated after that win because that was like that was the first Paul Rouge year.
Yeah,
and we were so. But yeah, and then the next year, it was. I reckon it might have been James Hurd's second last game in charge. I think we played you middle of the year, and we were actually pretty heavy favourites. We'd beaten the Bulldogs on the week before, and Joe came out and kicked 5. It was a shocking game, and Essendon won. It was very frustrating. Yes. It was definitely Hurd's last win as coach. I know that. I like it.
Yeah. I suppose the point of everyone listening going, why are they talking about all these random things? Essendon and Melbourne have one of the weirdest is it a rivalry? Is it like some teams play up to
I feel like it's the opposite of whatever a rivalry is because both teams tend to play worse against each other.
Whatever, some teams play up to their rivalry. So, like, no matter what is sort of happening in the derby, both teams go at it red hot. You know,
same as a showdown. Showdown's always great to watch.
Collingwood, Richmond, or Geelong Hawthorn. Generally, Geelong Hawthorn historically.
Anzac Day is normally pretty good, even if one team's way better than the other.
This rivalry is the opposite, where no matter where they sit on the ladder, it turns into an absolute dog's breakfast. No matter. And so, I think turning to the preview of this week's game. Assuming this will turn into dog's breakfast, if it is going to rain in Adelaide, it will be the 4th game on Adelaide Oval in 3 days. So God knows what the turf is going to look like.
And it's going to be raining. So
it'll be back to McCracken's paddock in 1900. I think it's going to look horrendous. But we'll jump into the preview. I've sort of sent you some questions that we might go into. The first is what I'm going to ask you is, if Melbourne do blank, they will win. What is the key to Melbourne winning this weekend, other than just generally being 80% better than the Bombers at everything?
So I was actually going to go with I think you're pretty on the money that Melbourne can control the air against Essendon, even without Grundy. But because it's going to be so wet, I don't really think marking is going to be a huge factor. I think it's if Melbourne is switched on defensively, in terms of a pressure rating, I think we'll win. Yeah, Essendon are going to give us looks. That's what Essendon do. I don't think they're at that level defensively yet where they can really shut us out of the game. And Essendon will get looks against us because I think Essendon are good enough to create. They're still a pretty good team offensively. Like I was saying before, they will score on you if you give them chances. Sure. So I think if Melbourne come, it's really cliche to say. I feel like Jonathan Brown, you just got to go in hard or some bullshit like that. But it's pretty simple for Melbourne. If we turn up defensively, I think the rest will take care of itself. That sounds horribly arrogant, I know, and I apologise, but I think that's a realistic way of looking at it.
No, it's fair, and I think the inverse is if Essendon do blank, they will win. I think the answer is Essendon somehow is, not, Melbourne is dead last in stoppage clearances. So as we were discussing, it's Melbourne conceding clearances around the ground to then set up defensively and intercept. In the
Yep.
rain, that interceptability is going to be harder, but if Melbourne can do it, it will be crucial.
Oh, absolutely. I
So
think that plays in Essendon's hands, definitely.
yeah,
That's a really good point.
so I think if Essendon are going to win this, which I think if Essendon win this, it'll be because eight things broke in Essendon's direction, not one. But the primary one is Essendon will win if they dominate the contested possession and stoppage clearances around the ground. Melbourne's so good from centre bounces that you're just going to have to ride your luck with that and hope your back six hold up until your midfielders can get back. But if Essendon can take advantage of Melbourne conceding stoppage around the ground, and instead of just bombing it long, working it forward by hand and doing that sort of stuff, they're in with a shot. But if Essendon get beaten around the stoppage around the ground, we're out. It's all over. And if we just win, but we bomb it long and Melbourne get the intercept game going, then it's going to be tough. So Essendon have to win the stoppage around the ground and they have to work it up by hand, which is going to be tough in the wet, but it's just the only way to beat Melbourne, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's really. I think the rain definitely changes the game. The rain. Obviously, you've got Stringer who's in good form, but I mean, he literally embodies what Essendon has been for like 10 years. I literally don't know what's going to happen when Jake goes on the field. It might be good, it might be bad. Like he could, like I'm pretty confident with Stephen May on him because Stephen May can play on multiple players, but Stringer's good enough. He could still kick it back, right? But he could also literally have five possessions
Oh no!
and not hit the scoreboard.
The difference between floor and ceiling for Jake might be the biggest of any player in the competition with his level of talent. Like
Yeah,
generally,
I
when
remember
got when
in
when gen-
2021, he was the top five player in the competition. I was shocked at how good he was. And then and he signed the contract and he's like, well, back to being inconsistent.
well, it could be. So there was the news this weekend about Jake Stringer's concussion issues towards the back end of last year. For 16 weeks, he basically couldn't run without getting a migraine. So
Jeez, I didn't know that. That's pretty good.
yeah, so
I
it was
apologize.
no. There were a lot of Kane Corns went at him like a rabid dog at the start of the year. But Jake, there's been long debates on the board about, should we be trying to turn him into a midfielder or should we just trying to build him up to be that sort of power forward sort of role? And I think it just takes him a couple of games to get into things. But historically, every time he gets a couple of games in, he injures himself. 2021 was sort
Yeah.
of the first time he got basically a season's worth of consistent football, and that's what you get. So hopefully, yeah, he's probably the X factor for us. So if Melbourne lose Schmuttt, what is it? What's going to happen? So Melbourne will lose if blank.
I think, look, I think in the wet, you do need to take your chances, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's going to be magnified this week. So I think if Melbourne goes back to being wasteful Melbourne with 30 inside 50s for a goal, I actually think we'll be in trouble because I can see us losing a low scoring scrap. I mean, you might remember 2 years ago in the Premiership year, we played Essendon at the G in another awful game. It was actually wet, and Essendon, like Melbourne, were on top for most of it, but never really kicked away. And then Essendon got it back to 8 points late, and they were whinged about Tip not getting the free kick when if you kicked the goal, it still would have been Melbourne winning anyway. Sorry. And it was sort of like it was just such a terrible game in the wet, but like Essendon did hang with Melbourne the whole time. So I think Melbourne really needs to take their chances because in the wet, you're not going to get anywhere near as many as you would on a dry day. Like we do look better up forward, but we can't be walking in a half time at like 2 goals to 8. Like, I mean, you would know that feeling from the weekend. But yeah,
Yeah.
we can't be doing that because the longer Essendon are in the game, the more confident they're going to get. So probably got to get away to a good start too. But we need to be taking our chances at least early.
And for me, Essendon will lose if Melbourne muscle up. And when I say muscle up, is that midfield of Oliver, Petrarca, Viney, Brayshaw, Harms running through there. If they decide that
He won't be in this week, by the way. I'm
he
pretty
won't be
we'll
in,
get to outs later, but
yeah.
he's had personal reasons. I don't know. He's missed the last 2 games. I'd be surprised if he comes back in.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
so I get your point.
yeah, insert Sparrow, insert Harms, whoever. But if they have the capacity to just, in rugby league parlance, it's muscle up, which basically means you decide to get in and get physical. And if the rain sets in and Melbourne just decide, right, intercept games out the window, we're just going to bludgeon Essendon at the football, I don't think we've got the cattle to go with you, particularly in the wet. So if Essendon lose, it'll be because the rain sets in Or there'll be multiple reasons Essendon lose this because Melbourne just a better team. But forecasting to the weekend, I think if Melbourne decide to just throw their intercept game out the window and play wet weather football, I don't think Essendon can go with them. We've just got a few minutes left. We'll talk about projected changes and tips before we go. So you already sort of insinuated that you think Harms might be out. Is that the only change you
Yeah,
think might happen?
the only well, he's already out. He's missed the last two with personal
Right.
reasons.
Okay.
Hasn't even played BFL, so hope he's all
Oh,
right. Not sure what it is. Like I don't need to know, but I doubt he'll come straight back into the ones
yeah.
because his form wasn't that strong for the first two games anyway. He was probably borderline on the chopping block. Ben Brown is a so Hibbo. Everyone loves Hibbo. Will probably. They said he's going to have a test for his Achilles. I think at his age, he probably just misses. It's either Achilles or calf. I can't remember which one, but
Yeah.
I mean, Hibbo's what 33 now. Like,
Yeah.
there's no
Yeah.
reason,
Yeah.
and he's borderline not in the best team anyway. I don't think Melbourne are going to take him, especially on a wet track. Like, we don't need to play him, so he probably goes out. In terms of who comes in, that's an interesting one because they might swing Petty back. Although I'm curious as to what tall forwards Essendon actually have available now that Wiedemann probably. I don't know if Wiedemann I think is concussed and obviously 2 meter Peter probably misses. Oh yeah, he definitely misses. He's out for a
Yeah.
while. Yeah. Aside from that, I doubt Ben Brown comes in. I mean, I sort of don't want him to. I mean, to be honest, I wish him and Tom McDonald both weren't in the team when we went with Petty and Van Rooyen, but they like to have the three talls plus the ruckman. So, but I doubt Ben Brown comes in. I would be. I mean, there'll be rioting in the Facebook comments from Nuffy supporters like me if Van Rooyen got dropped this week, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of your forward line for the Bombers. I think you're right. So Wiedemann diagnosed concussion. Even if he passed his concussion test, you couldn't, in good faith, the way he came off the field, play him. I don't think we're generally going. I don't think we have a key forward in the wings to replace him. A lot of talk about Patrick Voss, a young guy who's done a lot at VFL level, but he's not really a key forward. He's more a Jake Stringer, Cole Langford type, which is sort of your bigger medium forward, sort of explosive type. And so I think unless you're going to drop Heppel and swing Langford back or one of those sorts of moves, I think it'll be Wiedemann out and a small in to add some more forward pressure in the wet or just in general. You tend not to change losing teams, and Brad Scott historically has not changed teams that win all that much.
Oh, for sure. And you've already got two rucks, right? So one of them probably rests forward, even if like they're not great there, they'll probably rest forward.
Yeah. And our forward line has looked better this year with some combination of Harrison Jones, who is probably saved by Wiedemann getting injured. He probably loses his spot if Wiedemann's fit, but some combination of Jones, Stringer, Langford, and then you're resting ruck occasionally sitting deep in the goal square to allow those guys to get further up the field. And I think that's probably just a mix we go. We replace Wiedemann with a small for more forward pressure. But anyway, that's probably about it, really. Maybe you drop Heppel for another medium, but I think considering he played okay on the weekend, I don't think they're going to drop Heppel now. I think he's a bit like our Nathan Jones, if anything, in that regard.
Is he close to 300? Are they? Or
no, nothing close to 300.
Isn't.
But Nathan Jones probably got carried through the last 10 games.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, he did. There was a lot of people like there was. I'll just quickly go on that because a lot of people either skipped over this, didn't see it. There was an interview with him at this. It was either at the end of 2020 or the start of 2021, and he basically said that the club left it up to him whether he wanted to play on or not. And what that says, I'm sure everyone can infer from that, is that's the club saying, "Look, we're happy for you to go another year, but we're not guaranteeing you a spot."
Yeah,
which is basically what they did. They got him to 300. He played one more game and then didn't play again.
That's basically
might be something similar with Heppel.
Yeah, no, it's basically exactly what they're doing with Heppel, to be honest. But he played okay at the weekend, so I don't think he's going to get dropped for next week, even though the pressure was, like a dripping tap. And in any event, that's probably all we got time for, Schmuttt. I'll get your tip, and then we might say goodbye.
Yeah, so I scaled this one back a bit because of the wet. I'm going to go Melbourne by 8 points. I think we'll just do enough.
Well, you're very generous. I have Melbourne by 6 goals. So
look, I will say real quick. I posted on our board. Look, I think we might belt Essendon this week, but then I also said, well, every time I've said this, we either lose or we scrape it in. So we'll probably lose or scrape it in. So, Melbourne do tend to play the level of their opposition a little bit sometimes, and Essendon aren't that bad. But I would be quite surprised if we belted you.
All right. Well, thank you, Schmuttt, for joining us. It's been a pleasure
Thank
to
you,
have
mate.
you on. And with that, we might wrap this up. Thank you for listening. Subscribe and let your friends and Essendon supporting mates know. Have a good weekend. Go Bombers.